As always, when I am working with a right and a left, I want to make sure that I have a nice, um, clear, understandable right and left. So I always uh, butterfly the pieces open so that I have one on the right and on the left. Now, with these back skirts, it doesn't particularly matter that much, only because these skirts are cut very symmetrically. But as a general principle, this is how I usually do it so that I make sure that everything is clear. Now, this basting is very basic. Just match up the exterior edges and baste 1/8 of an inch from the outside edge using a weak white basting thread. Now, this thread is permanent stitching, but it doesn't have to be done with a super strong thread. You'll notice also that the top layer is just a little bit full, and that's because with the skirts, particularly as the edges fold under, it's possible for the top to get a little tight. So then we repeat this same process with the front. So you see me right there, making sure that I have a left and a right, and I put them right in front of me so I can't miss it. And then I grab one set and I will baste around the exterior edge, and then I'll do it again for the second one. You'll get really used to this kind of basting. For me, it's something I don't even think about anymore. It's just 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and it's this one particular uneven basting. It's really the only basting that I use most of the time when it comes to this type of step. I don't like even basting for this for some reason. It never seems to hold the pieces the way that I want to. And this piece is almost done, and you can see that I've already completed it on the second piece. So now we're about to move forward with attaching them to the bodies. Again, I've laid everything in front of me so that I can clearly see a right and a left half. I don't want to get anything confused. I mean, it's a little hard at this point because the canvases are attached, but it's still a possibility. So you just get into the habit of doing all of these little things that will prevent you from making mistakes. Anyway, the top of the skirting is slightly wide, so I'm letting a little bit just hang off toward the side back seam. And I use the side back seam because if there were to be any alteration in this garment, that's where it would happen. We would not be altering it center back. So I'll use the excess in the side back because that's where I might need it at a later date for a change in size. Anyway, this is a nice straight base, a little distance away from where we'll be doing our stitching. This is temporary stitching here, and I'll do that on both pieces of the back and then both pieces of the front. And once they're attached, then we will proceed with doing the actual back stitches to hold these skirts in place. Now, the fronts are a little bit odd because we've got this curvature and the point to work with, and I've created the pattern in such a way that it just should match up perfectly. Because of the slightly flat section at the bottom of the point, we're going to have a tiny bit of extension. Once the piece is done, you'll see that we have a little bit of extension off where the actual body appears slightly longer than the skirting. And that has everything to do with the bone casing that we'll be building at the center front of this jacket. But you can see here, I'm just forcing the edges to match as I baste everything in place. During the pattern making phase, I was very careful to make sure that these edges were correct for each other lengthwise. So that's not something that I should be worrying about. Often in commercial patterns, you'll find that because of the way they grade them, sometimes there's a little bit of discrepancy. And I try to avoid that when I'm making this kind of jacket. It is time now to begin our back stitches that hold the skirt and the body together. We have done our basting, and you can see the basting is about an inch away from where we're stitching the actual seam, and we're using a back stitch. Now I began with a reverse back stitch just because I find it easier to get a solid start on the seam, and then I'll push the needle through to the back side and I will complete the seam with a regular back stitch. Also, notice that as I'm doing this stitching, the cut edge of the material is facing away from me and the main body of the fabric is towards me. This gives me more control over what the fabric is doing, which results in less handling and fussing and a little bit more efficient work. As I reach the end of the seam, I will take a few stitches in one place and clip my thread. I sometimes forget to talk about this, but when I baste seams and then stitch the seams, I'm just using the basting in place of the pins, because with hand sewing, your working thread will get caught around your pins and it will get tangled and you could stab your hands. It's really uncomfortable. So I always stitch the seam and immediately remove the basting and then check the seam. And it's exactly what I'm doing here in the image. So my next step then, now that all the seams are sewn, is to press them open. And, there's no magic to this. There's just using the iron and getting the seam pressed. I'm trying not to stretch too much because that could distort the way the waist hangs on the body when it's done. I've got a really good steaming Rowenta here, so I'm making sure to use lots of steam to keep those seams open. I'm giving the skirt a nice little touch up as well in the front, and that way I can see how it hangs. Now, you can see that little extension off the front that I was talking about there. And now I'm moving on to stitching the backs. Again, there's no mystery to this. It's just a straight seam. It's basted first and used a back stitch to do the actual stitching. As I'm finishing up the back stitching here, I'll just take a couple stitches in one place, clip my thread, and then immediately remove my bastings. Watch what I do here as I press. I keep forgetting to mention this too, and I usually will press the actual seam as it's flat before I press it open. And what that does is it kind of crushes the actual stitching and sort of locks it in place. Since we're creating a looped structure with each stitch, I want to make sure that I flatten that out and kind of force the stitches to be crimped and secure. It makes the seam a little bit better when you flay the seam allowances open. And then I'll use this little block to cool the seam allowance and put it in place. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.